Welcome to Somebody Asked Me with Janice Case, the podcast where we take questions I've been asked in the past from so many different roles, along with questions you'll ask and we'll ask together to, learn. Along the way, we'll build our capacity to become a community of problem solvers. I'm your host, Janice Case. Let's get to it, shall we? All right, folks, welcome to episode 5 of Somebody Asked Me with Janice Case. So somebody asked me once, back when Montana and Sid, two of our kids were in elementary school, how it was that they seemed to understand that when I said no, I meant no. Now, it was a typical weekend evening, probably like a lot of you guys. We were friends with a lot of our kids' friends' parents, kind of a thing. And we're all spending time together. And this fellow parent had just had a really frustrating interaction with her daughter, where her daughter asked if she could have something or whatever it was, and was told no, and then proceeded to keep asking over time until my friend, her mom, frustrating and frankly just wanting to relax with no interruption, finally gave in. So if that little scenario sounds familiar to you, you're gonna want to keep listening. This week's episode is more broad than that. So we're going to return to the children and parenting realm to explore just how we go about setting boundaries for our kids, how much structure is too much, how do we combat the pressure of other parenting styles, especially, for example, those of our kids' friends' parents, and just how we go about supporting our kids and understanding that no means no, and why it's important that they do understand that and that they can respond accordingly. Now, I am thrilled to be joined again by my friend Melissa Ellis. You guys will remember her from episode 3. Between us, we have a lot of experiencing influencing the lives of young people in different ways, which I felt like was really important here. And as I kind of said last week, I think in my sneak peek to this week, Melissa is somebody who, we really have made a connection around being able to talk through some of these really important topics. And so she's somebody that I'm hoping is going to become kind of a regular voice as we continue to work and learn together. Good morning, Melissa. How are you, my dear?
I'm doing well, Janice. Thank you so much for having me again.
Oh my gosh, of course. So it is, I'm going to set the stage for people. It's 7:30 a.m. my time, so a little bit later your time on the East Coast, on a Sunday. Here it's raining, and it is also the Sunday we sprung forward. So congratulations to both of us for being here. I'm just saying. Sometimes it's easier than others, right?
Absolutely. No rain here, thank goodness.
Well, I'm glad for that at least. All right. Yeah. So listen, I've set the stage with my experience back when I started the podcast as an educator and a parent, etc. But what we know is that the whole idea of being parents, so we talk a lot about parenting here, and I always want to be really clear with people that we're using that term because it's commonly understood, knowing that there are a lot of people influencing the lives of kids who don't fall under the official, if you will, definition of parent, right? Exactly. I might be parenting you, but I'm your grandparent, right? I might be parenting you, but I am a family friend and you live with us now, whatever it is. So what I love about having your voice with us today is that we can make a really big argument that those of us who influence the lives of kids indirectly, if you will, and by that I mean, again, you're not in that official role, are really equally important. And I really feel that way because, and I do this too, by the way. I have nieces and nephews and great nieces and nephews, and I love to be the cool aunt, right? I love to be the one who lets them have ice cream for breakfast or whatever it is once in a while. But the fact is that on a regular basis, if we're not reinforcing the importance of boundaries and consequences, then we're contributing to some mixed messages for kids. There's no question about that, and we have to really kind of think about that. So when I think about, for example, going back to my friend who asked me about, my kids listening to no, it was apparent to me that she frequently let her kids have their way, so to speak, especially in social settings. And as they got older, of course, this was going to turn into a bigger challenge. But with all that in mind, tell us a little bit about the role you play in influencing the lives of kids, so we can kind of get a sense of where your comments and your insights today are going to be coming from.
Absolutely. You basically hit the nail on the head. While I don't have any biological kids, I'm a godmother of my 15-year-old godson has lived with me since he was 4.
Right.
So while I'm not mom, his mom is very active in his life, he's under my roof 24/7. He's with me Monday through Sunday.
Yep.
And so I am the parent. I'm the parental influence in his life. I also have 2 other godsons who are my best friend's kids. One is 6 and the other just turned 10.
Okay.
Who I spend a great deal of time with. And so I spend a lot of time parenting, and in that case, it is, as you said, it's kind of being the reinforcement
Yeah.
to the rules and boundaries that she set, but still also being able to be who I am, because we do have different styles and different ideas, and there are some things that she thinks is, just never, never, never okay, and I'm just like, that's not so bad. They're kids. So
Right.
we have to walk that tightrope to make sure that, as you said, we're not sending mixed messages and confusing them as to what they should do when it's the right time to do something.
Yeah, that is so important. So again, like I said, your view is going to be so important here. And you just made me think of something else, Melissa, that idea that we tend to fall into a parenting style, and and for us it's the right one, it's the only one, right? And there's, I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with that, but I am suggesting, and you just hit it on the head, that being open to the people in your lives who also love your kids and their thinking, right, is something that we
Yeah.
should all consider. And you just talked about how you can offer that perspective, and I'm going to go into excuse me, here in just a minute, some kind of research based, if you will, parenting styles
Hmm.
as a basis. But what you just said reminded me that probably one of the most critical learning periods for me as a parent was when Joe and I got married, because that was a second marriage,
Hmm.
right? That wasn't the first marriage. and
Right.
and when I had my two biological kids, of course with their dad, we kind of established our co-parenting style, right? Like it just kind of naturally occurred. But with Joe, he had been parenting one way, I had been parenting another way, and we had to really be very explicit about our beliefs, why we did what we did the way we did,
Yep.
and then come to some consensus about how we would move forward parenting, six kids. And I had never really even thought about it that way until you just said
Yeah.
that, right? But what a great check for both of us, right? At that point in our lives as parents, that was kind of, created because we got remarried, but isn't necessarily something you have organically, because with my girl's dad, we never really talked about, here are the different parenting styles, and here's what we're going to
Right.
do, and here's why
Right.
it is, right? We just kind of started to parent like the baby gets handed
Yep.
to you in the hospital, you just start parenting. So
Right.
interesting,
And
something to
I
put a
think
pin in.
that's a very good point, because we hear all the time there's no guidebook to parenting, there's no instruction manual to parenting,
Right.
and so we have to accept that we could be doing it wrong, and
Yes.
not overall doing it wrong, but making mistakes, or that some of our views are probably shaped more from how we were parented than how we need to parent. So
Yes.
we don't think about those things very often, but I've actually been addressing, and we can talk about this a little bit more, but I've been addressing little things like, do I want to spank? Do I not want to spank? Do I want to do this? Do I not want to do
Sure.
that?
Yep.
And it's in a world where those rules have been kind of set by what we went through as kids. Well,
Yeah.
this is the way my mom did it, so
Yep.
this is the way I'm going to do it. We have to be open to hearing other ways to do things, because we are influencing the lives of people. Like, these are going to become adults who
Yeah.
are going to influence our world, and we have to be doing the best we can.
That's exactly it. I love that so much. And I think that's going to be the big takeaway from today. So, spoiler alert, folks, we're going to give you that, right up front, that is going to be one of the big takeaways, is that if you do nothing else after listening to this conversation, have a conversation with other adults who are parenting, right? Have the conversation of why you do what you do. What are the beliefs that are behind it? So we'll try to remind each other to circle back to that at the end.
Yes.
So every time we talk about a topic like this, right? Of course, we're bringing Melissa into the conversation for the reasons you just heard her talk about. We're always going to try and bring some resources toward you. And the one that I went back to today, it's a book I read years and years ago. And it's years and years old because you can't see it, guys. But when you look at the cover of it, it's a bunch of teenagers, sitting hunkered over their cell phones, which is a very common image these days. Except theirs are all flip phones. That's how old the book is, right? They're all flip phones. And I just looked at it and I laughed, and I was like, but it's still so pertinent. So the book is called The Price of Privilege, and the bigger topics that she covers is how parental pressure and material advantage are creating a generation of disconnected and unhappy kids. So that's the big focus of the book. But we get into the kind of more narrow, if you will, topics of kind of how we're parenting, and because that's at the basis of course, all of her research. And the author is Madeline Levine. So I want to start by using her references to 3 key parenting styles. Now, you guys can go Google parenting styles and get 27,000, I'm sure, right? So we're going to use this just kind of a focal point, if you will. So it's not all inclusive, but it's a starting point for our thinking. So she gives us 3 styles. I'm going to run through them real quick, Melissa, and then at the end of the 3 of them, we could talk a little bit about kind of maybe examples that we've seen, or, just some general thoughts about them. So the very first one she calls the authoritarian parent. And what she says is that while typically engaged with their children, they rely on a very strict and flexible set of rules for running their households. They're not interested in hashing out differences with their kids, nor are they particularly interested in their kids' point of view. They believe that discipline that's enforced swiftly and without discussion is the most effective way to parent, and are very controlling. Authoritarian parents are more demanding of their children than they are responsive to their needs, and they're often disciplined to support their child's growing autonomy, since this is likely, or I'm sorry, disinclined rather, to support their child's growing autonomy, since this is likely to change the balance of power between them. So that's the authoritarian parent. So some things to attach to that, right? Some ideas are because I said so mantra, right? If you're the parent who seriously uses the because I said so mantra on a regular basis, we joke with our kids all the time using that mantra because we think it's funny because our own parents used it. But if you're the parent who uses it seriously, this might be a style that applies to you. So the tricky part about authoritarian parenting is that though kids in those households seem to be reasonably conforming and obedient, they also, from a research perspective, have low self-esteem. They often have poor social skills and high rates of depression. They often lack curiosity. They tend to show higher rates of aggressiveness. So there are some cons, right, to that. It might feel good day to day because everybody's doing exactly what you said all the time, but there are some cons that are going to come with that. So that was authoritarian parent. And actually, let me break it up a little bit, Melissa, by stopping right there and saying, I know for myself, I can go back to my childhood and go, yep. So what about you? Any experiences with that type of parenting?
Yeah. So even my childhood in this topic is very interesting because I was raised by my grandmother Monday through Friday.
Okay.
And I spent weekends with my mom. And the two were very different. My mom had a very much so because I said so
nice,
kind of way of doing things.
Yep.
My grandmother did not. So I'm waiting to hear the other styles so I can determine where she fell.
Yeah.
But I can tell you that my mother was very much that because I said so, do what I say, not what I do.
Sure.
Kind of parent. And I find that on social media, even today, you'll see a lot of memes and things like that where people are referring to that idea that you eat what I cook or you don't eat.
Right.
Kind of attitude. And I see people posting things about that and I'm just like, yeah, that's definitely my mom's parenting.
Okay. All right. I love that. All right. So let's talk a little bit then about the next one. So permissive parent. And folks, I would encourage you to do exactly what Melissa and I are doing, right? Relate it to your world, right? Where do you see examples? Was that the household you grew up in? Do you have a friend? Wait a minute. Do I see a little bit of that in myself, right? That's all a part of this kind of learning process. So the next one was permissive parents. So permissive parents tend to be friends with their children. They see parenting as a collaborative effort between parent and child, and their relationships with their children are warm. Permissive parents are more responsive than demanding, and they are reluctant to exercise control over their children. They tend to be extremely involved with their children, but they don't often insist on appropriate behavior. So, for example, their response to criticism of their kid's poor behavior is likely to be, it's just a stage she's going through, or to dismiss them. And certainly this flashes forward to next week's episode where we're going to be talking about, again, your role as a parent, but in schools, very specifically about this notion of helicopter parents and snowplow parents and stuff like that. And so this gets at that a little bit. I can see us coming back to that. But so they tend to try to protect their kids from consequences. They avoid confrontation with their children, and they have trouble tolerating their kids' unhappiness. Now, again, what ends up happening, because you hear a couple of things here that you're like, okay, well, they have a warm relationship, which we all want, by the way. We're going to talk about that. But what ends up happening when you're avoiding confrontation and you're kind of adopting a do your own thing mentality with parenting is that children have little sense that the adults in their house are the ones who are in charge. which can be scary, by the way, because kids actually need to know somebody is like steering the ship, right? They often struggle with structure in other environments. They tend to be impulsive, immature, manipulative, and have, interestingly enough, lower rates of academic achievement and higher rates of substance abuse. Now, the upside is that they tend to be more likable and sociable, right? They tend to be the kid that teachers go, oh, right, yeah, always a smile on his face. But then when pushed, right, and their boundaries set, that's when they become really challenged because that's not something they can adjust to. Any experience there, Melissa?
I can't say I have a lot of experience there. I think there's maybe like, because of course we're talking style, but I think there's little bits of each style that have permeated themselves into, my life overall. So while my grandmother may have been some of that, not to the point that I would call her permissive by any means.
So this is exactly why I have you on, right? Because you're picking up the nuances that I think are going to be so important for people to grab onto. And that is that what I'm hoping people are going to get a sense of is where and across all three of these do they see evidence of their own parenting, right? I honestly don't see it black and white. Now, I will say I saw a lot of permissive parenting as a school leader and as a teacher. The number of conversations I had to have with people where I said, you can't be their friend right now, right? They need you to be the person who has structure and boundaries and rules and stuff. And trust me, even though out loud they're saying, don't give me boundaries, don't give me routines, don't give me structures.
They need them.
They need them. The research shows it. We know it based on our experience here when they come to school. So that would be probably my experience, was from that angle. All right, let's talk about the third one then. So the third style she calls authoritative parent. So not authoritarian, where we saw kind of the dictatorship, if you will, in the first example, but authoritative. And what she talks about with authoritative is that they're warm and accepting, so you get the warm piece from permissive, but at the same time, they set clearly defined limits and expectations. They are both demanding and responsive, and in general feel they are in control of their households. Support rather than criticism or punishment is typically used to encourage children to meet expectations. These parents are concerned with things other than simple compliance or being friends with their kids. So we kind of see the first two as opposite ends of a spectrum, and this one is, as we can hear, is falling somewhere in the middle. So they're clear about their parenting role. They don't look to their children to make up for a lack of connection or friendship in their own lives, which, by the way, is some of the research behind the permissive parent, that you're missing out on your own adult relationships, and so you're using your children to fill those roles. And as a result, they do, in this authoritative model, they do a good job of meeting the needs of their kids. This type of parenting supports the child's growing autonomy by focusing both on independence and connection. This isn't, and I just use the expression, so I'm going to correct myself, this isn't middle of the road parenting, but it is a highly committed and unique parenting style. So I don't want us to think that, if I pick a couple from here and I pick up a couple from here, that's what this is. It is a very kind of highly developed parenting style, where that results in children having more balanced attitudes about achievement, better social skills, higher grades, lower rates of substance abuse, and less depression, right? Because they have a firm understanding of what's going to be happening in their homes. All right, so what are you thinking, Melissa, around the idea of the authoritative parent?
No, I can tell you that while I may not be successful always, that's the style I aim for.
Yeah.
With the kid living in my home, my own godson. I think that's what most parents want, even if they aren't fully aware that that's not what they're doing.
Right.
I think even the authoritarian parent wants that. I think that's what they think they're doing to some degree. And they're not. So I think that's the one that we're shooting for. I know it's the one that I shoot for. Although I do, if I'm completely honest, I do have periods and circumstances and situations where the others creep in.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. And I love that point about, I think it's what most parents aim for. And, again, in my experience, I can say that I think there are plenty of parents who, nope, they're going to be authoritarian and this is how it's going to be and that's how I'm going to do it, right? And we see the results of that. But I think you're right. I think in general, as parents kind of think about the parent they want to be, right? Mm-hmm. It's what they aim for, which is, and I'm going to encourage folks, okay, go do some digging on that, right? And again, the whole notion of your own self-check, have the adults in your life help you self-check and figure out where you are on that. So I will say this, one of the other really important pieces to the research that I'm referring to today is that she talks about how regardless of your parenting style, right? It has to start with a warm, loving relationship.
Yes.
And specifically, I just love that language because essentially she says without that, we're going to fail, right? We're going to fail. You might have a kid if you're an authoritarian parent who does everything you say. But at some point, that's going to fall apart if it's not based on a warm, loving relationship, right? At some point, the resentment grows enough, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel like I'm describing a really bad after-school movie, but right, I feel like we've all seen it go down. So the warm, loving relationship, I think, is so important. And she basically says, lots of times when we think about parenting, we think about discipline, right? Because that kind of inherently comes from structures and
Right.
boundaries, et cetera. And she says that we want to aim for a disciplined strategy that is clear, firm, and fair, and that eliminates endless discussions about what is and isn't okay in your household. So think about that, folks. Do you find yourself constantly in that cycle, right? The constant battle, especially as your kids get older, right? Even when they're young, but especially as they get older, where there's a constant battle about what the rules are, right? And what the idea here is that if you establish early on, right, that warm, loving relationship, and upon that then base a set of expectations and boundaries, etc., and you're clear and firm and fair, and I'm going to add consistent to this,
There you go.
then you stop that vicious cycle of constantly coming back to. But you said this was okay. But you said, I'm going to go back to my friend from the beginning of the conversation, right? That was a big part of the ongoing battle because once you concede after you've said no, then as far as the kid knows, the answer really was yes. They just had to figure out how long it was going to take you to get to it. That's a very confusing place for kids to be. Okay, so all of this kind of leads to the idea of helping get us to the simple idea of no means no, right? I started with that almost a little humorously, but because again, it's not necessarily supporting an authoritarian style, but it is supporting that when you have those clear, consistent rules and you're firm and fair and consistent about them, that you eliminate those things because everybody knows and everybody understands. So one way to think about that, right, is this idea of establishing family rules. You state them, you post them, you live them, right? This can include everything from contributions around the home, how we expect you to behave in school with respect to things that are going to help you be academically successful, living up to commitments, how we treat one another. A big one in our world now, of course, is going to be the role of devices, right? That has to be a part of it because they're so prominent in our lifestyles. But coming to an agreement about what they are, and then posting and living by them. And we're going to talk a little bit here in just a minute about how important it is that everybody is living by them. So Melissa, now that we have all three of those parenting styles kind of out in the open, and we've talked about each one of them a little bit, what do you feel like you find in the very unique role you have in your godson's life and some of your other, like you said, really close, the children in your life? How do you go about establishing those kind of expectations and boundaries, etc., to develop your own parenting style?
Well, when you threw the word consistent in there, that's the glue to me.
Okay.
For just about anything with the kids or just in life in general. Being consistent is very important, but especially for children.
Yeah.
Because you can't have them getting 50 million different messages. So there are times, Janice, when truth be told, I just have to bite my tongue.
Yeah.
Because their mother has said something and that's what it is. And I don't like it. And I don't agree.
Sure.
But that's what it is because that's their mother,
Yep.
With my own godson, the one that I'm raising, there are times when I don't agree with something that maybe his birth mother has done, or maybe I've even changed my view on something that I said before.
Sure.
But it's a matter of being very clear with him about that. Well, okay, in the past I said that this was okay. But as you're getting older, that's no longer appropriate or whatever the case may be. So I think that consistency and that openness and being honest, I think a lot of times we as parents tend to forget that our kids are people. Like they're little people, so they have feelings and thoughts and emotions. And I think when we show them that we are people too, that make mistakes, that might get it wrong. I don't have a problem apologizing if I'm wrong, those kinds of things.
Sure.
So I certainly feel like, and I want to be very transparent here, I struggle with permissiveness. I struggle with permissiveness because when we have more of a friend relationship because he's not my biological child.
Sure.
So when I got him, it was loving auntie, and now I'm parent, and there's a transition there that is a little tenuous at times, where I actually have to remind myself that no, you have to be, even when I don't want to say no, you have to say no because that's what's best for him.
Yeah.
So I think it's just a matter of being open to making mistakes and accepting that you're going to make mistakes.
Yeah, and I'm going to add to that, Melissa, and say, and be transparent with your kids about it. Like, I think, one of the things that we do with kids in classrooms, and we encourage teachers to do with kids in classrooms, is acknowledge that you don't always have the answer, and acknowledge when you think you do, they're not always the right answer, and be transparent and open about when you would do something different. And that goes, even going further in that education analogy, that goes to even as an assistant principal and deciding on a consequence for a kid and being willing to come back and go, you know what, I've thought about it some more. And I actually think that I didn't think about this. And so now we're going to talk about it again. Or I didn't think about that. Like modeling for kids that we're going to screw it up because we're human. And by nature, we're going to screw it up. But how do you fix it, so to speak, right? Once you screw it up, right? I think, exactly. So what you're really describing is that modeling piece. And I think that's, again, another folks, big red or big green light of one of the big takeaways, right? Is being willing to model what you expect and need from them, right? Because you're not raising kids, you're raising adults, right? We're all working really hard to raise the people who are going to run the show after us. And who do we want them to be, right? Who are the people we want them to be? So then, okay, so you work really hard, you establish the boundaries, again, kind of according to this train of thought, you are being very clear about expectations, you're writing them down, you're agreeing to them, now you're living by them, like I said. I'm going to throw that role devices back in there again because I think that's a really powerful example, and you've heard it a million times. I'm not the first person to say it, but if the rule is at the dinner table, no devices, that means nobody has their device in their hands, including mom, dad, grandma, aunt, uncle, whomever, right? Like people please. Like that part's easy. That should be simple, but we have to be willing to live by it. So, so when you have boundaries and you have all of those structures, then of course you have to have the plan for when they're broken, because guess what? They're going to break them, right? They're humans too. They're really going to screw it up differently at different ages. And so what can they expect when that happens? So you got to be willing to be the bad cop, first off, right? Again, it speaks to that whole permissive parent model that, if we just let everything go because we don't want to have confrontations, etc., then we're developing kids who aren't going to actually be able to function well in other settings. But one of the things that I think is a really important message for all of us is being clear ahead of time about the consequences, right? Being clear about what the potential consequences are, right? And again, there's age-appropriate things to think about, timeouts when they're younger, grounding when they get a little bit older, restriction of privileges, whatever those are, those kinds of things. But being clear about consequences. And I actually even fell into this. It's one thing to say it, do it, have it, live it. And then you have day-to-day life happen, right? And so I actually realized recently that I was falling into this trap of being too general with our 12-year-old recently because, and I'm trying to remember I can't even remember what the issue was, like the possible thing that she might do. But I would joke about, yes, if you do that, then, oh my gosh, the consequences are going to be, whatever, huge. But not being specific. And I was kind of doing it in a joking way. And now I had to remind myself recently that her 12-year-old brain is not fully developed. So even though 12-year-olds act like they understand sarcasm, nod their heads and laugh along, in her head, she was really freaking out because she thought this will be if I make this mistake, it's going to be huge, right? And so it was through a conversation that I realized that. And I said, oh my gosh, okay, first off, let me back it up and apologize. I should not have been making those big general statements. I thought I was being funny. That's my bad. So let's be specific, right? If you do this thing, you would probably, lose your devices for 3 days or whatever, right? So, right. And what I find is that when kids know, honestly, just kind of like us, it's no different than I'm driving down the highway and the speed limit is 65 and I have to decide if I'm going 65 or 80. I'm always going 80. There you go for all my police friends. So, but in that decision-making process, what I know is, well, if I get pulled over and I'm going 80, the consequence is probably going to be a ticket that could be this much money. Or if I get, even though we don't necessarily consciously think through every piece, we are making the decision based on the consequences as we understand them.
Yep.
We have to do the same for our kids. So tell me a little bit about how you think in terms of how we can have conversations with our kids to establish those things.
Well, see, I absolutely love the way you handled the situation with your 12-year-old. Like you said, like putting the brakes on, backing up, apologizing, all of that, I think is very necessary. And I think that a lot of parents, and I'll raise my hand, myself included, you mentioned very early on in the show that fear of losing your power with a child, especially as they get older. When you start talking about teenagers, like my son is 15.
Absolutely.
So it's a very, I feel often like at any moment he could probably, at some point, the parental fear, the fear they have that you're their parent and therefore you can do it starts to dwindle as they get older.
Oh,
so
yeah.
That's not enough. We have to really understand that as parents, especially as they get older and they get bigger than you. You really have to understand that the fear is not going to work. So you have to lay that groundwork very early so that it's not fear, it's respect.
Yes.
And I think that being open to being human to your kids, apologizing when you're wrong, going back to fix things you've messed up is how we have to do that so that they do understand that this isn't, I don't expect you to do this because you're afraid of me. I expect you to do this because this is what's right. This is what you have to do.
Yeah.
So I love that approach of actually just being vulnerable and transparent and honest and not operating from fear.
Yeah.
It's funny because we tend to want to rule by fear, but we don't want to operate in fear. We're operating in fear.
That's exactly right.
They're going to not listen or they're not, So I think getting rid of that fear as much as possible is the best possible way.
I just love everything that you just said. And I love that you're able to, take what I said and kind of pick it apart a little bit and see the pieces of it. I just love that so much. And I appreciate that you dug down to that fear part. And we're not going to get into the conversation today about physical punishment. Right. That's a whole different conversation, right? Mm-hmm. But to your point, you have to think about, regardless of how you're creating an environment of fear, right, you have to ask yourself, to Melissa's point, how long will that last, right? And how far am I willing to go? Because the older they get, the less some things are going to scare them, right? And so what am I willing to throw on the table to make them scared enough to do what I say? And to your point then, at the same time, when they go out of my home, right, and they go to school or they go to their friend's house or whatever, I would probably not in a million years be okay with another adult using fear to get my kid to do what they want. In fact, I say to my kid, if something scares you, if you get a pit in your stomach, if you feel any of these things, you should call me. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you don't need a reason to, you just call me. And so I can't operate with fear as my mechanism at home and then expect that my kid's going to do the right thing out of respect when they go to other environments, right? They're going to be looking for the adult who's going to, wield the hammer, so to speak. So what you just said is so important because what happens is that's exactly what happens. We then are raising kids who don't know how to function when there's not fear controlling it, right? Exactly. If there's not somebody wielding fear, who's in charge and what am I supposed to do, right?
And as they become adults, like there's less to fear.
Exactly.
Like, so how are they going to make decisions as adults if they don't have fear driving them? That's where we see kids basically, just kind of go wild and just start doing whatever because the fear has been removed.
Yep.
And now they see this whole big world and they don't have the skills necessary to maneuver it and make decisions and do the right things when necessary.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the other piece I want to add to this is, so we're talking about setting boundaries, kind of setting the rules, being very clear and consistent, all of that based on a warm and loving relationship, being willing to model those, living by those rules yourself. We've talked additionally about being transparent with our kids, being willing to acknowledge when we're wrong, being willing to acknowledge when we're unsure, right? Like in the moment, you just did this thing. I really don't know what the consequence should be. I'm going to think about it, right? We're going to go to our separate spaces and I'm going to think about it. Modeling that, I think, is critical. But then the other piece of that is, okay, you've laid out the possible consequences and all those wonderful things. remembering not to change them in reaction mode, right? Because, in the conversation I'm going to have next week with with one of my school counselor friends, we talk a little bit about, it's all fine and good until you hit the hiccup, right? And you hit the hiccup and your rules were kind of there. Maybe you never really even felt like you had to write them down because your kid was just doing a good job. The bump is coming. Like, that's just the bottom line, right? Because they're kids. And so if it hasn't happened yet, it's coming. And what we don't want to do is make all these decisions in the middle of a crisis, right? In the middle of, and by crisis, I mean, it could be something very small, but we always feel like the world is ending. So, in the middle of something tough happening, right? We want to plan ahead with them, and we want to make sure we don't change them in reaction mode, right? We don't set our kids up for failure by, okay, here's what we've agreed to live by, here are the potential consequences, and then they do something that either scares us or surprises us so much because, of course, we thought they were perfect and they would never do something like this, and then we go crazy with it because we're reacting. Yeah, again, it's that moment then to be willing to say to your kid, okay, you know what? This is brand new territory for me. And so I'm going to back up and we're going to take some space and we're going to figure this out. But I'm not going to just say in the moment what's going to happen, right?
And I love that, Janice, especially, and this is probably me speaking from my own experiences more, but dealing with teenagers, that's huge.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
That not reacting thing is very big.
Yep.
And I'm not always great at it. So that's a takeaway for me that, you know what, this is new. I'm going to back up and take a moment and start this over, because there's been times where I'm like, oh, if I don't walk out of this room right now, I don't know what's going to happen to the kid.
Right.
So, and that's not something I ever want to do because I don't want the fear to be there. But yeah, that's a great point, that it's okay to just hit the brake.
Yeah.
And say, no, I'm not going to do this in this moment, because in this moment, I'm not thinking clearly or rationally. I'm reacting to what I'm feeling. I absolutely love that.
Well, and think about the modeling again you're doing for them, because this is real life, right? This is exactly what they're going to encounter in real life, at work, at school, at, in their own families as they get older, etc. And so modeling for them that in those moments, it is not it's not an example of weakness when you stop and say, nope, I'm going to think about it. I'm going to reflect on it. That's actually a display of strength, not weakness. So again, beyond the kind of rules and consequences pieces, right? So I want to talk now a little bit about structure, right? So we've talked about kind of rules and consequences and expectations. Oftentimes I get the question from parents, how much structure is too much? Where's the line, right? How do I, for some parents it's, but they have to experiment. And for other parents it's, oh my gosh, if I let them out the front door, they might die. So I'm not going to do that, right? So it's almost, it's kind of tied into that is this conversation around, some parents who will say, well, they have the right to their privacy. They have the right to conversation is what I call it. And it seems kind of cliche, but my response to that on some level is, do you know where your children are, right? As a general kind of tagline for this whole conversation about how much structure is too much, and they have their right to their own privacy, etc. So here's the thing: as our kids get older, right, around this part of the conversation, we're going to contend with more posturing and annoyance from them, right? We're ruining their lives, slamming of bedroom doors. But the payoff, right? And the parenting research shows this time and time again, that kids need boundaries, kids need structure, kids need routines, right? Those are the ways that we show them we care about them. Those are the ways that we demonstrate love. And the payoff in maintaining them and being strong as they get older and they're more rebellious, and you start to get the I hate yous and all that fun stuff, is that you're gonna be building and maintaining a healthy connection with your kids, and you're gonna help to ensure their safety, right? And we know that healthy relationship and ensuring they're safe are self-evident, right? Those are the things that we know we're all aiming for. And I think that, so I think of some examples. So in today's world, of course, now we get the extreme pleasure of not just thinking about boundaries and structures, and that right to privacy, et cetera, in terms of their physical space, but we get the really wonderful privilege of doing that around their online piece, right? So now we have to think about it in two ways. And so those are constant conversations that I've had with parents over the years about those things. And I think that, here's kind of one of the messages that I want to share. And then I, of course, again, want to get your feedback and thinking about it, Melissa, and then hear any messages that you would share. So a perfect example, right, is I would be able to say to parents, based on my own real life in the moment parenting experience, that my two girls, so Joe and I have a blended family of 6 children, our children, two of them though I had on my own for years. And they, the message from them from very young was there's no hanging out without supervision or without me knowing where you are, right? Like, we're not the family where our kids are going to be walking the neighborhood, be dropped off at places to wander around. In our most recent example with our 12-year-old, evidently it's a thing in her middle school for kids to walk to Target after school and hang out. And we just kind of laugh and we say, oh heck no, like that's nope, not even, like not happening. And we say, because the fact is, those poor Target people, I feel so bad for them, that they have this onslaught of middle schoolers, right, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon who are just like wandering around unsupervised. And B, we say to her, here's the thing, this isn't a commentary about you or your friends, but it is a fact that when kids are unsupervised in places like that, they are more likely to get themselves into some kind of trouble. Somebody's going to make a bad decision. That's the truth of it. And we remind her, as we did our other kids all the time, your brains aren't fully developed. Like, you can't rely on your own brain to help you make all the decisions right now. So that's not us, right? We don't do that. And frankly, that whole piece has continued with our kids into high school. Like, Montana and Sid were probably 11th grade, going into 12th grade, before it was okay for them to say, hey mom, I'm going to go hang out with so-and-so at her house. And I would let them go without calling or texting that parent to make sure they knew that was happening. And that was not easy for us to maintain. That boundary was hard because some other parents were doing it, but a lot of other parents weren't. It was very rare that I got a phone call from mom who said, hey, I know, so-and-so's coming over to hang out. Just checking that you know that, right? But we maintained it because we just said to them, look, for us, it's about, our mantra has always been trust but verify. It's not that we don't trust you, but here's the thing. Here's the rub right now. At this age, and I would say it's from about this age of 12 up, it is your genetic makeup right now is telling you to push every boundary. It's telling you to experience everything, right? You want to do it all. Our response is to not create the opportunity for you to go too far. Those things are completely in opposition of each other. You want to push every boundary. We're trying to make sure you don't have the opportunity to do it, right? Like, our job is to make sure you don't have the opportunity. Now, you're still going to do it. You're going to get some stuff in there. We know that. But we're not going to create a set of conditions that ensures that you do all those crazy things, and that's how we end up not being safe, right? So anyway, so that's kind of the general approach that we've taken. And yeah, we maintain it even into older high school, even when some parents would say, well, they're old enough to decide. Yep, they are. And yet we're still going to ensure that we know where they are and they know where they are, etc. Right. So anyway, what are some experiences you have on your end?
So for me, I think one of the things that I always wanted to ensure that I did was raise a compassionate kid.
Oh, yeah.
I never wanted, like, the whole issue of bullying kids or ostracizing kids in school. Was something that I never tolerated. And I don't know, I think growing up, I was raised by my grandparents. My siblings were with my mom. So there were times where I just felt like I didn't fit in. And it wasn't anything anybody did. It was just our circumstances.
Sure.
I never wanted that. So in high school, I often befriended kids that others wouldn't.
Okay.
Or that others didn't.
Yep.
And so I wanted him to do the same. So one of the rules in my home is we don't bully.
Yeah.
We don't pick.
Yep.
We don't make fun of, because you don't know anybody's circumstances.
Yeah.
And so that's one of those things that I think he now knows and gets, is just not gonna happen. And if I find out that it has happened, then it would probably be some of the most dire consequences of any that you face for anything else you could do. So I think that is very much where the conversations with them and the consistency is important. That's something that I've always said to him from elementary even up until now. I'll randomly ask any new kids in school, any new kids join.
Sure.
And did you speak to them?
I love that.
Did you introduce yourself? Are you kind? That's just not that's not acceptable
Yeah.
to not be that person. So it's things like that, but also the rules you have about, hanging out. Now he has a best friend who, by this point, I've spoken to his mom enough so that if he were to say, "Can I spend
Absolutely.
the night at Caleb's?" then he can go stay at Caleb's. But other than that, yeah, I'm very much like you. There is no just going to hang out if I don't know where you are. And that's a safety issue. And in today's world, we have to be cognizant of the fact that, it's just not the world we grew up in.
Yeah.
And kids are, they're not always safe. And you can't convince them that they're not. Like
Yeah.
you said, even though their brains are developed, they think they have all the answers.
Of course. Of
My
course.
son swears that if anyone tried to snatch him, he's going to take them out. Kid, you're 5'2" and barely 100 pounds away. You know
Right.
what I mean?
Right.
So it's that kind of stuff. So I definitely agree with you that you have to set those kinds of rules and stay firm about them all the way through.
Yeah, and again, I love that last example because it is they in their heads they think, they think
Yeah.
I've got this. Like they really do
Yep.
think that. They believe that. So and it that of course drives me to think in terms of safety. And again, we talked about the online piece, and that's going to be a whole nother episode down the road about how we help support our kids in that environment. But I love the example of, oh no, if somebody tries to snatch me, I'm going to take them out. Okay, yep, let's talk about how that's going to happen. All right,
Exactly.
because we do prep them, we do empower them, but we know like here. But again, that comes back to, that's true. Oh yeah, I'm sure you're going to take them out, but just in case, right? Let's not create the conditions where you could actually be snatched. How about we just not create the conditions, right? Oh my gosh, they kill me. They're so funny. So, but you know what? To your point, the whole reminding so our kids are always going to push back. They're always going to say, but why, right? And I think it's important that as the parents we have the why, which moves us away from the experience we had as kids of because I said so, right? Because the why is important because that helps them understand our thinking. They are going to raise children of their own likely at some point in their lives, right? Let them understand the thinking. And a really great example, just yesterday on our Nextdoor app in our community here, I happened to be scrolling through and I read about a parent who was upset because a bunch of, she called them, she thought maybe 13, 14-year-olds had congregated in a close by park at the end of the school day. And she was there, they did so by a playground, and she was there with her infant and like her 4-year-old daughter, whatever. Anyway, they started grouping up, kind of getting in a circle, two boys in the middle. She could tell something was happening. And there were other people around who did not do anything. And so she had her infant in her carrier and she stood up and she kind of yelled over, hey, what's going on? And there were some kids were pulling out their phones, getting ready to videotape something. And of course, that was all my red flags as a school leader who had to investigate many fights like that. And she, and she just, she's like, what's happening? Oh, it's fine. They're friends. It's just I can't remember what they called it, a slap off or something. And she was like, nope, that's not happening right here, right? Like, that's not okay. And she pulled out her phone and she's like, I'm going to call the police. And they dispersed, right? So that kind of speaks to the next piece that I want to talk about, which is this idea of the role of the village, right? So I, when one of the things that I used to do with rising ninth grade parents at my high school was we would have a start of the year, evening where they could come and we would do a bunch of stuff to help them transition with their kids to high school. But I used to talk with them, and the kind of the name of the presentation I would give them was that the village is gone, right? So and the message was, without going through the whole thing, was that once upon a time, for some of us when we were growing up, even in rural communities like ours, there was a village, right? It was small enough, people knew each other, people knew each other's kids, and it wasn't unusual for somebody else's parent to be like, what are you doing? You can't do that, right? We would to some extent parent each other's kids. That village is gone, right? Even with the parents of my kids' friends, right? I saw it evolve and realize that unless we talk to each other about, all right, so if your kid does something, right, how do you want me to react? If we don't talk to each other, then we tend to just not do anything. So in spite of like seemingly endless, the seemingly endless kind of capacity of kids to be contrary, right? When we set clear expectations and we set up consequences, teens are going to push back constantly, right? And yet they are capable of adhering to them. All the research shows, as I said earlier, kids need and want limits no matter what's coming out of their mouths, so to speak. But the message for these parents was, you have to build your own village, right? You cannot parent your kid alone. Your kid is with you a very little bit of the time from this point
Yep.
forward as a high school freshman. So you have to be thinking about who is the village, right? Is it going to be the friends of your parents of your kids' friends? Is it going to be other people sitting in this auditorium with us right now? Like, who's the village? Because otherwise, you're parenting when they're with you, but what's happening when they're not, right?
They're not.
And so and then we talked about empowering them and saying, saying things like doing what this mom did in the park the other day, right? She didn't know a single one of those kids, but being the parent, quote unquote, by standing up and saying, I'm an adult who cares enough to ask what's happening and to make sure it doesn't happen, right? Like, again, the different definitions, if you will, of parenting. And if she hadn't done that, who knows what would have happened? And these days, we tend to not do it, right? What'll happen if I do that? Will somebody else get mad? And so switching the storyline with our parents at my high school and saying, look, here's what it looks like. It looks like you have a group of mom friends and you guys walk every morning. Great. How about you make one of the stops the bus stop randomly, right? Maybe once a week, you stop by the bus stop. What's happening at the bus stop, right? Are there kids who are completely on the sidelines, as you said, kind of the outliers? Are there kids engaging in activity that could be dangerous? Are there, and the message was, that doesn't make you the police. That doesn't make you the bad guy. That makes you an adult who cares about what happens to kids, right? In your community. So that notion, again, that we have to actually build that village ourselves. So what have you seen, especially with your godson, but even some of the other kids that we're talking about in your life around that idea of village?
It's and I think you hit the nail on the head in that the village is gone, or at least the village as we knew it.
Yes. Good point.
Gone, because I've lived in the same location for a little over 10 years in my complex.
Okay.
I don't know anybody.
Wow.
And nobody knows me. So I don't have that neighborhood person that will keep an eye out kind of situation.
Sure.
So the village has been, as you said, one that I've created. And luckily, in my situation, it's been through my family. It's me. It's my son's mom. It's my best friend. It's my best friend's mom. And so we have that kind of village. But I agree that even the reach of that village is limited once he is in school, or once he is hanging with a friend, or spending the night, So I've tried to, and I probably need to make even stronger efforts to have a better village with his best friend's mom.
Yeah.
To just make sure we're on the same page with some things, and she knows how to respond in the event that he does X, Y, and Z. But I love the idea that you said of creating the village. And looking back, I can see that I have done that to some degree, but it has not been a very conscious thing.
Yeah.
And I realized hearing this that it needs to be.
Yeah.
And it can be. Like, I can reach out to his best friend's mom and say, hey, let's sit down and talk about how we're going to do these things.
Yep.
And I think that if more of us were willing to do that, I think we just get so wrapped up in our own bubbles.
That's it.
With work and, anything else we might have going on, that we forget that that's something we should be doing as well.
And to your point, you have to be deliberate about it, right? It doesn't happen accidentally. In fact, what we're seeing in the world around us, the opposite happens when we leave it to accident, right? That we become disengaged, and I can't say that to your kid because you might sue me or whatever it is. So so here's how I would couch it for parents. Give each other permission to tell each other when your kid's not being perfect. If my kid is out there and you happen to be witness, or whether firsthand or you've heard it from your own kid or whatever, to my kid making choices that are not good choices, then please tell me, right? I give you permission to tell me when my kid's not being perfect. And I think that's really important in this world, because social media tends to do the opposite, right? I post all the time about my kids' achievements. Of course, I'm celebrating them, etc. I'm not intentionally doing that to make it look like my kids are perfect, because, oh my God, they're not.
Regardless.
Yeah. Exactly. But that's what comes across, right? And it's because, of course, I'm not gonna post about their trials and tribulations, because that would be humiliating, right? So we don't post that stuff. But my point of posting all the achievements isn't about, look how perfect my kid is. It's about celebrating them, right? But it comes across that way. So we actually really do deliberately, I think, have to say to each other. So when you have that conversation, Melissa, with your godson's best friend's mom, as you said, then part of the conversation can be, and by the way, I know he screws it up sometimes. He's not perfect, right? We could probably talk for hours about how our kids aren't perfect. So please know that when you witness that, I welcome you saying it out loud to me. It will not offend me. It will not upset me. Please tell me when my kid's not being perfect, right?
And Janice, I think something else that we as parents have to own is that pride piece.
Yes.
We all want the world to think that we are doing the best job ever as parents.
Yep.
We don't like to admit that we make mistakes and that we're not doing well. So when our kids do something, and I'm very guilty of this, the first thing I'll say is, oh my God, he's going to make me look bad.
Right.
And then I have to stop myself. I have to stop myself and say, it's not about me.
Yeah.
It's about him getting on track so that he does well.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of times we take it as if a parent has to try to discipline our child in some way or brings it to our attention that our kids are doing something wrong, we immediately think that they think that we're not good parents.
Yes.
And that's probably not even their thought process in the least bit, because we as parents, we all know kids, no matter how what you say, do, how well, they're going to make mistakes.
Yep.
They're going to make bad choices. And we can't be worried about how that reflects on us or what somebody else's opinion of us is going to be as a result of it. We have to be open to hearing that, okay, he did this thing. How do I get him back on track, or her back on track?
Exactly. And that is the being deliberate about being the village, because you have that conversation and you give that permission and you're open about that. So that ties kind of nicely into this idea of how we build the village with other parents. I love that you already put on the table being willing to set aside your fear of what it makes me look like when my kid makes bad choices. You're going to think it's natural instinct, and then stop yourself and say, wait a minute, it's not about that, just like you just described. But then thinking about in terms of, okay, so my parenting style is not always going to align with your parenting style. What you would do is not always going to be what I would do. And how we talk to our kids about that, and how we talk to other parents about that, right? So very briefly, I'm going to share, this came up for the first time with me with one of our kids when they were back in middle school. And I'm still trying to be careful about when I use my kids' names and when I don't, because, I don't know at what point they'll be mortified. But one of them, when they were back in middle school, and she was at a friend's house and they watched a rated R movie, and she was not allowed to watch rated R movies yet at that point. And she came home, and within a 24-hour period of time, she wanted to talk about it. She put it on the table. She confessed, right? Which I loved about her. And she was, because she was so stressed out because she knew she wasn't supposed to. And she was so stressed out that she had. So what was good about that is it told me that I've set the expectations in a way that she understands that no matter where you are, those are the rules. And in this unique case, there was there were parents there, and they were having a little whatever that they were doing, and the kids kind of asked off, and the kids did what kids do. They asked when they knew the parents were distracted and would tell them yes, and they did it, and the parent was like, yeah, that's fine, go ahead. So because she came to me, she had a consequence, believe it or not, because she knew the rule and she broke the rule. But she expected a consequence. She knew that was going to happen. However, the consequence was much less significant, because that was always one of our baseline rules. If you're honest, it's always going to be less of a consequence than if you lie and I find out. So she, we had the conversation, she got the consequence. She, consequently ended up telling her friend about it. And then friend's mom called me to say, oh my gosh, it's all my fault. Please don't give her a consequence. I'm the one who blah, 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 blah. And this was a person I knew well. She was a good mom. It's not like she was a bad person. And I just said, gosh, I really appreciate you calling and clarifying. But I just want you to know that her getting a consequence isn't your fault. She knows that our rules are our rules. And I said, and I know this is simple because it's a rated R movie. It's not the end of the world. But the next time she could be at a friend's house whose parent says it's okay to drink. Right? And so I need to know that when the stakes are big, she knows that the consequences will happen. I don't care what the adult who was with you said. Great. Right? So anyway, that was kind of, that's one of the things I think we have to think about in terms of the conversation you're describing with this other mom, right? The how we set the stage for this is how it's going to work.
Yeah, that's great. I love that, actually. And that is something that I struggled with his best friend's mom early on. Was I think she allows things a little bit less strict than I am. She's a
Sure.
little more carefree. And so there were times where I'm just like, oh no, 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 we don't do that. So I love that it's not about what anyone else is doing. It's about your rules in your house, within your family, and even outside of your home, but within your family, and that your children know that and are going
Yes.
to honor that regardless.
Yeah.
That's the takeaway for me on that, is that it's I can't control what anyone else does, but and the child needs to learn that. You may not be able to control what anyone else does, but you always have control over yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. I love that last piece, right? Because even from a very young age, we can send send them that very empowering message, and couple that with, and here's how you get out of it, right? If you're in a situation where you're getting a lot of pressure and you feel like you kind of have to cave because of the social circumstances, that is one of the beautiful things about every kid having a cell phone, right? Like you text me and say, I need to leave, and I'm going to call you, and we're going to make up some reason that, oh my gosh,
exactly
something
right.
happened.
So that you're not, that's exactly right.
Yeah, so that you don't have to face that, right? Because, and that is one of the things that devices are beautiful for. We can use them to our advantage. And lastly, on that topic, and then we're going to talk about some pitfalls and wrap up. Another example is, and again, it speaks to how we're going to have these conversations with other parents, right, who influence our kids, or other people who influence our kids. We have to be willing to, like I said, but we've kind of talked about, be willing to say, hey, look, tell me when my kid's not perfect. We also have to be willing to admit our own mistakes, right, as parents. And I say that because another example I can think of is a situation with a parent who came to me because she had, like, long story short, middle school again aged. Kids had gone to a friend's house. They were having like a birthday party. There were kids there, but there were also parents there. And the parents made the mistake of kids in the basement, parents upstairs, and there was a bar in the basement. And so, shockingly but true, a couple of the 13-year-old girls decided to take shots of tequila. And it was one of those things where it's like everybody was nervous, everybody was scared. Only two of them did it, and it was a real hasty, like, take the shot, oh my gosh, kind of one of those things. But again, this parent had become aware of it through her own kid. And so she called, the mom who hosted the party. And interesting, and of course the mom was mortified. Any of us would be, right? Any of us could make that mistake. And she was mortified and just, oh my gosh, beside herself, etc. And, this is what I'm going to do to make sure it never happens again, etc. All the great things you would want to hear. But then when the mom pushed further and said, so somebody needs to contact the parents of these two girls. Like, they need to know their kids took shots of alcohol, right?
Right.
And the mom was like, well, you know what? They're here all the time. How about I just talk to them myself? She did not want to be the bad cop in the life of her daughter's friends. And it was so fascinating because, eventually they got to the point where mom number one said, look, if you don't call them, I'm calling them. Like, and she said, look, here's the thing. I get you wanting to protect them, but what if this isn't the first time, right? You assume it's the first time. What if it's not? They're never going to know it's a problem if nobody tells them.
Nobody said, yep.
Right? And so then they kind of came to an agreement. But again, that notion of we have to be willing to admit when we make mistakes to each other, right? Yeah. So those are some of the pieces that we wanted to make sure that we were able to share with you all today. And this last part has really been around, aligning your thinking with the adults in your kids' life who are going to influence them, right? Oftentimes that's the friends of their parents, and I will, or parents of their friends rather. And Melissa, I will go back. You mentioned your community. Another part of that, and that'll be another episode for this podcast, is really how you build that village in your community and the circumstances you talked about. So, but the last thing I want to wrap up with is a couple of pitfalls, and then as always, Melissa, I'm going to give you the last word here, but some pitfalls to avoid. And I'm going to go back to the book we were talking about, The Price of Privilege, because a big part of that book is about in affluent situations, what's happening to kids. Like, we think, oh, they have money, so they must be okay. And now we know very much that that's not always the case. But she says that avoid the pitfall of affluence in so much as busy parents already feel guilty about the little bit of time we have to spend with our kids. And so it's really easy to fall into the trap of not wanting to spend that little time in conflict. So that's when we tend to blow off the little things like, all right, so he didn't put his dishes in the dishwasher. Again, no big deal. Or she left her jersey at soccer practice. Again, no problem. We'll just buy a new one, right? We tend to let the little things slide because we don't want to engage in confrontation because we have so little time with our kids as it is. But the results, right, of that sidestepping of discipline, definitely the results are that kids are not learning how to take responsibility. They're not learning to control their impulses, and they're not learning to be thoughtful. So if you've established some rules and some expectations around things that are large and big, or small and big rather, and you let the little things slide because you're just trying to avoid conflict, we end up, getting ourselves into a problem with kids who now don't have boundaries, don't have structure, and we heard some of the results of that. Avoiding the pitfalls, like feeling like we have to keep up with the Joneses. We're not going to go deeper into that. I think everybody knows what that means. We mentioned already making threats you won't follow through on, right? None of the consequences you establish for your kids should be things you won't actually do, because friends, I promise you, the first time you say, if you do that, I'm going to take your device away for 3 days, and then after an hour you give the device back, you just established a pattern that is going to be hard to come back from, where your kid knows, I can wait them out and then I'll get my way. And we've talked already today about why that's not good for your kids socially and emotionally, etc. So don't make threats you're not going to follow through on. I think the last couple that I wanted to, we already talked about not letting your desire to have your kids like you be what drives your parenting. Don't be guilty of not following the rules you've set yourself. And then lastly, I'll just say that, this research shows that a lack of firm limit setting is one of the major contributors to adolescent dysfunction. Let me say that again more clearly. A lack of firm limit setting is one of the major contributors to adolescent dysfunction. So when you're questioning yourself, when you're saying, oh my gosh, am I being too hard? Oh my gosh, evaluate again those 3 parenting styles. And if you're not being authoritarian and you're being authoritative and you're setting healthy boundaries, etc., remind yourself that they need that to be functioning properly. And the last thing I'm going to share before I turn it over to Melissa for the last word is this. Remember that your kids hear us. Remember that they hear you. Here's what I mean by that. We all have those moments when we're talking with our kid about whatever it is, something that's a problem, maybe it's a mistake, maybe something we're, thinking about that could happen, whatever it is. And, the older they get, the better they get at rolling their eyes, huffing, turning themselves into themselves, trying to ignore you, right? Turning away from you physically, whatever it is. And that dissuades us because we think, oh, I'm lecturing. And if you're lecturing, that's a problem. That's a different topic. But, they're ignoring me. Oh, they can't hear me. Oh, whatever. They hear us. And this was really reinforced with me again recently, again with our 12-year-old, because we had an issue with she's 12, she's in 7th grade, so it's drama city, right? That's what happens in 7th grade. I always say if a girl can survive 7th grade, she can survive anything. So, so she's there and she's in the midst of it. And we're having this conversation about these interactions with her peers. And she's doing it all, rolling the eyes, kind of huffing, kind of, whatever. Okay, I gotcha. But it was later when we were talking about something completely different. In fact, we were talking about one of my podcasts, and she said, you know what? I hear you. Like, even when I'm doing that stuff, I hear you and I think about it later. Like, I know in the moment I'm not acting like I do because it's annoying and because, I don't want to be there and I already feel bad or whatever it is, but I do think about it later. So I do hear you. So I want to leave you with that they hear us. And so it is critical to decide what is the message we're trying to send, because they are going to hear it.
I love that.
So what do you think, Melissa? Last word.
I think that the thing, let me say first that the reason I love doing this with you, Janice, is because I learn something every single time.
Oh, you're sweet.
Like I walk away with something, a new way to think about something, a different way to see it. And so I just hope that the people listening, whether they are parents themselves or just have some kind of interaction with kids in any capacity, that they will be open to, one, learning more. I can guarantee you that I will be doing research after this.
Good. I love
even
that.
More. So I want people to know that, especially if you're a parent, it's okay to stop. Like, that was probably the biggest thing I got today. It's okay to say, you know what? I got to find a different way.
Yeah.
Stop and figure it out.
Yep.
Because we owe that to our kids.
Amen.
We owe it to them to give them the absolute best that we can, and to not just rely on what the world tells us or what our upbringing was like or any of that. There is so much information at our fingertips And if you've taken the step to listen to somebody ask you, you're headed in that direction. You're listening. You're open. Keep being that way. And not only do that for your kids, but do that for you, because it will make this journey, this parenting journey, easier all the way around. Not just for the kids, but for the parents.
Oh, gosh, I love that, Melissa. And right back at you, my friend. Thank you again for joining us. I'm looking forward to having you again here very soon. You are the absolute best. Take care, okay?
I love you. Thank you so much.
All right. Love you. Bye. Okay, as I tape this post to the interview I just had with Melissa for episode 5, you guys, probably the way I know we have the potential to have impact with this podcast is that as soon as we hit stop record, Melissa said, "Oh my gosh, I'm going over right now to have a conversation with my best friend about parenting. I feel like I'm about to engage in a parenting overhaul." And folks, wherever you are on that kind of parenting spectrum that's so complicated and so hard, if the conversations we're having are helping move you to think in that way, if they drive you to, gosh, I'm going to go look at that book, I'm going to go look up a couple of articles, I'm just going to have a conversation with my best friend who we talk all the time, and we talk about how we do things, but we don't talk about the why. Like, why do I parent the way I do? And we certainly don't give each other feedback on how we're doing it, which is such a critical piece. If this conversation drives you to do that, then we have achieved exactly what I hope we set out to achieve. So thank you for that. Thank you for listening. Make sure, if you have not already, you like the Facebook page. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. Make sure you are sharing this, right? Certainly, I am more than happy to have this conversation and know that 5 people are listening to it. But gosh, how incredible would it be if 500 people were listening to it, if 5,000 people were listening to it? So with that, let's do a sneak peek for episode 6 that's coming up next week. So we're sticking with this realm of children and parenting. And folks, I knew that coming out of the gate with all these different topics I wanted to cover, some were going to be heavier than others. And yes, my first couple of podcasts drove us back here because friends, mostly friends, because that's who's listening right now. Thank you, friends. I love you. Responded and texted me and said, "Hey, gosh, I really wish you'd talk a little bit more about this," or "Gosh, what about this though?" And so that's driving, right? Already, I actually had 12 episodes mapped out, but I'm allowing the listener voice, I'm exploring and loving the listener voice drive the conversation and the order of the conversation. So with that, next week, episode 6, we're going to build off of, back in episode 1, we talked about parenting your kids in, actually it was episode 2, parenting your kids at school with respect to choices around their education, right? Actually what levels of classes to take, colleges, all that fun stuff. This one came from some input from there where they said, okay, that's all fine and good, but talk to us about how much parenting at school is too much, right? Like what should I be thinking about as far as the boundaries of that go? Which led us to think in terms of exploring this idea of parent labels as they apply to education. So in episode 6, we're going to consider these notions or these ideas of helicopter parents, snowplow parents. There are some others that we're going to bring up. How do you know if you're one of those parents? Because folks, we never think we're one of those people, right? But how do you know if you're one of those parents? What are the benefits? Are there any benefits to your being one of those parents? And then what are the cons? And there are some cons for your kiddos when you are one of those parents. And how does your parenting approach at home cross over to the school environment, right? So we can't talk about them as if they're in silos. They're not. They're very much blended. So thinking in terms of how at home influences at school. And so you're going to see us flash back to some of the stuff that Melissa and I just talked about. We're going to be joined next week by a veteran school counselor and very dear friend of mine, Loretta Jacoby, who's going to offer her insights on how the most effective students from, benefit from their parents' approach to their learning experience. And I just love that. And I think it's going to be powerful for every single one of us to tune in and listen. So with that, be sure to join us next week and we'll get to it.